In middle school, I started to wake up sad. I didn't know why or when it would happen, but by high school, I stopped wanting to wake up at all. I used to tell myself each morning that things would be better, then beat myself up at night for being a liar when they weren't. I started to count down the days until I died when I realized how slowly it would come. How my hands shook like my voice still sometimes does. I learned then, to be depressed is to slowly suffocate on your own silence. It is speaking yourself back to life, even when your tongue is tied in the shape of a noose. When I was 17, I was raped by a boy who inhaled my youthful desire to be wanted and breathed back the stench of a woman's fear. Afterwards, he held me, and we fell asleep outside beneath the night sky. His eyes, they twinkled like the stars, and the tender way he held me convinced me the nighttime must have swallowed by no instead of the darkness inside of him. That day, I realized to be woman and depressed is to have silence re-enter your body without consent. And there it remains throughout the day, uninvited into these bones you call home, trying each day to claim it as house. I moved to New Orleans when I was 18 years old. I was a walking corpse whose life felt like an open casket funeral that no one bothered to show up for. I had just left a hospital where each day I was reminded that help for this kind of sadness was reserved for those whose skin matched the powder and privilege that got them there in the first place. I remember once, a pair of blue eyes with a sharp tongue asked me if my family could even afford to keep me in a place like this. I'll never forget how her lips curled into a smile when I left because they couldn't. As I walked out, I remembered to be Black and depressed is to literally not be able to afford to stay alive and that be exactly the way they wanted. It is remaining silent about your hurt because you don't know how to say that you sometimes want to die when so many who look like you don't get to live. It is knowing when you say Black Lives Matter, you're not including yourself in that number. It is knowing that either way your days are numbered, and sometimes you are the one who is counting the loudest. When I was 22, I came back home to Kenya, and I swear I could not breathe the air. Everywhere I went, the stench of sadness followed. I convinced myself that people could smell it seeping from my skin. It took me a while to realize that the smell was not my own, that it filled the streets of Nairobi long before I got here, would remain long after I left. I remember the day that I realized my kinfolk, we are a dying forest. Each of us growing up to cut down the trees that we bloomed from, our sadness sharpening our blades while our silence rushes to clot the wounds that we don't speak of. That trip, I learned to be African, an immigrant, and depressed is to see your sadness as an import. Just another thing that has colonized your body and mind. A panga you've been told has missed your family tree, even though its handle is made from your bark. It is having others see poverty, violence, addiction, and disease as defining your culture. It is never speaking on these things so they do not define your culture. It is the shame you feel thinking your grandmother survived the emergency with less tears than you cried today, and not having the language to ask her. It is knowing that most days you have survived the civil war of the self, but today may be the day your soldiers stop fighting.